Welcome, and in this lesson, we're going to take a look at AWS S3 permissions. So I'm actually logged in as my admin user now. And of course, as long as my IAM user has access to a bucket, I can do anything I want with that bucket. As long as the user has read-write privileges and administrative privileges over a specific bucket. And that doesn't always mean administrative privileges. It could just mean full privileges to just that Amazon resource bucket. And we'll demonstrate that. Since I have privileges to the S3 bucket, I can go to my properties or even inside of my bucket. And what we were looking at before is, well, we tried to access this publicly, right? I can download it as long as I have permissions as an IAM user to view the contents of the bucket. And I do. I can even double click on it and open it up because as an IAM user, I have permission to view this document. However, this URL and every single object inside of S3 has a unique URL associated with it that can be provided or given to somebody to download it over the internet. And it is by default private. If we click on it, we'll get access denied unless we otherwise specify. So for example, I could right-hand click on it and select Make Public, and that would solve permissions problem. I can also go to permissions and select on Add More Permissions. And I can specify who I'm doing this for. So for example, if there was another user account that we had associated on this bucket using an access control list, which is a little bit more advanced than this course goes into, we could see that other username here. So we see my root account username here, which is actually the owner of the account. But to make it public, I can just select everyone. That's the same thing as right-hand click on Make Public. So if we select everyone, we give them the permission to open and download it. Hey, do we want them to give permission to be able to view permissions and edit permissions? Probably not. So we'll just go ahead and select Save. So now if we were to click on this, it is available to us. Now, if you notice before, even though I had users to view this document, even though I had permission to view the document through S3, we were not able to view it. If I go to the other tab, we were not able to view it through the browser because AWS can't authenticate my user through a URL. So that would be the difference between public and just being able to download it. Now that being said, let's go back to our buckets and right-hand click on our bucket and go to our properties. If we come down under permissions, and there's two types of permissions. We have static website hosting, which needs to work in conjunction with public permissions. And then we have regular permissions. Well, under our regular permissions, we have attached bucket policy and a CORS configuration. A CORS configuration is terms of allowing cross-domain access for documents inside of our bucket. Now, this is more of a JavaScript application hosting thing, and this is something that we cover in great detail in the AWS Certified Developer course at linuxacademy.com. But we can add a bucket policy. Inside of this bucket policy, this is where we can actually say, all right, anonymous users have access to this, or we can allow another AWS account. Well, you can click on the bucket policies and look at some of the examples. And it's not expected at this point in your career, if you're going for an associate level and working for the CSA exam, knowing how to write this from scratch isn't an expectation. Knowing how to use it isn't really that much of an expectation. Access control lists are a little bit more advanced of a concept. Knowing that we can do it and grant access to another AWS account, as architects, as associate level architects, that's very important. I know that I can limit my incoming traffic based off of just IP address. Even if we set it as public permissions, my bucket policy will override that, saying, okay, well, it's public permissions as long as it's coming from this IP address, or as long as it's coming from this HTTP header. We can also make it that it requires a user to use multi-factor authentication to do something like delete an object from a bucket. And that's what a bucket policy does. It's creating a policy for that bucket, a policy that bucket has to conform or respect in terms of permissions. Now, if we browse up here, we have restrict access to a specific IP address. So what this does is it actually applies that this IP address has access to specific actions. So we could say that the IP address only has access to download documents or upload documents. And then this is how we specify it here. as long as the IP address equals this. Or we could say as long as the IP address does not equal this, right? And these are CIDR ranges. When we have a /32, that defines one IP address, which would be this. And then we have the 24 CIDR range, which defines a grouping of IP addresses. So our Amazon CloudFront actually uses bucket policies in order to create a relationship to our distribution. And it gives specific permissions to that distribution regardless of other permissions set. And it creates that inside of our bucket policy here. And we'll look at that as part of our CloudFront section. We're going to look at this bucket name. This bucket name is important because I'm going to show you how to create an IAM policy that says a user has access to view a specific bucket and not other buckets, because I want to demonstrate how we can integrate IAM with Amazon S3. I also want you to really understand the differences between a bucket policy and IAM policies. IAM policies define access for users for our AWS account, for our API keys. So if we head over to Amazon IAM, and I'm just going to open it in a new tab, and we go down to our user section. If you recall, we have this user developer, both of our groups that have power user and administrative access. So currently this user has no access. And if I open up that user and do a refresh inside of the AWS account, because I had it open in the browser, you're going to notice that we don't have permissions to view this bucket. However, what I want to do is I want to give that user permissions to my Amazon S3 Linux Academy Test 2015 bucket. However, I don't want that user to have permissions to my other two buckets. So how would we do that? Well, if we open up IAM and go to policies, we have different ways of doing it. We can say just in general, S3 read access, S3 full access. But that would say this applies to all of our buckets. With IAM, we can create it down to the resource level by Amazon resource name. And each bucket is an Amazon resource. So we'd have to create a custom policy. So go ahead and select Policy Generator. And then from here, we're going to start with the AWS service. So we can select Amazon S3 and then the actions that we want to have. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that we have to think about what permissions are required based off of what tool we're using. If I'm using the command line interface or an SDK, I could only allow access to a specific bucket and it be just fine. However, if we're using the console here, so since we don't have any permissions for our user, if we look at the page and if we're using the console for our developer user, we're going to get a permission denied, right? So we need to be able to list the buckets if we're using the console. Then we need to have permissions on the bucket that we want. Because even if we have permissions on the proper bucket, unless we can list all of the buckets, we're not going to be able to even access our bucket through the console. So again, if we were using the command line tools, we could just manually specify the bucket that we're uploading to, for example. So the first thing that we want to do is browse down and we're going to list bucket and all of my buckets. And then we're going to do that on all AWS resources and then select add statement. Then I'm going to select another policy that's going to grant permissions to only a specific bucket. Keep in mind here, we just granted list permissions to S3. So if I go down to Amazon S3 again, and we'll go to select actions, we'll do all actions, and then specify the Amazon resource name. And we can do that by typing in our resource name. So I know that an S3 resource name is ARN:AWS:/S3:::, then our bucket name, which would be, if we head back over to our S3 console and our regular user that does have access, and we copy in our Linux Academy Test 2015, and we come back in our IAM, and then we select add statement, next step. And by viewing this, we see that we have permissions to list all of our buckets, regardless of the bucket name. Then we have permissions only to perform all of the other actions like delete, change, manage permissions, upload on the Linux Academy Test bucket. So we'll go ahead and select create policy. Then we'll head over to our users. Actually, let's do a back. I need to make sure I get that policy name that was just created because we didn't create a name for it. So I can find it by looking at creation time and then copying my most recent policy name. And then we'll head to our users and then developer. That's the user we're testing with. And we'll attach the policy. We'll insert in our policy name. and then we'll select attach policy. Then we'll head over to the browser that's using the developer user and hit refresh. We should have permissions to list the buckets. And then we should not have permissions to view the contents of this bucket, and we don't. It's not our Linux Academy test bucket. So if we go in the Linux Academy test, we do have permissions. And so I have permissions to do everything because I was granted those permissions. Now, I could alternatively say only give me permissions to use the test folder in that bucket. So if we head back over to our policy again, we can modify our policy that we just created and say, all right, only allow the user to do stuff inside of the test namespace or subfolder of that bucket. So we'll save that. We'll head back over to our developer user browser and we'll hit refresh. We can still view the buckets, but if I open up Linux Academy Test, I'm denied access to that. Well, the problem is I didn't grant myself permissions in order to view the contents. But if I was using the AWS command line interface, I could still access that test bucket. We would have to modify this again to allow us to read or list contents of all buckets up here. So you can see how access policies work. And that's really what I wanted to show you. So we're just going to come remove this here, which gives us all of our permissions back again. We'll hit refresh and then we'll be able to access the contents of that bucket. And we can go down to give permissions all the way down to the object if we wanted for an IAM user. So that concludes it for this lesson. Go ahead and complete this lesson.